I want this to be digestible chunks of understanding the details of how to play Savage Worlds. The last video we talked about a brief overall review of the system. Then we talked about here's how you play Savage Worlds, the kind of dice you need the playing cards, you need tokens for bennies, things like that. And this one we're going to really start drilling down into, okay, well here are the specifics. I want to keep this in, like I said, digestible chunks of about 10 minutes. It makes it a little bit easier to understand. You can go back and your attention span won't get lost as I'm droning on for an hour and a half. And I'm watching the counter now. I'm already in a minute. So let's do this. We're going to start with the core concept of your character. It's super important that not only do you play something that you want to play, but you need to be able to balance this off of what everyone else at the table is playing. I'm not saying you got to have the fighter, thief, mage, cleric. That's whatever. That's up to you. But you do want to be able to balance what the table is doing. You want to be able to balance what the GM has in mind. But the biggest piece of advice I can give you is you want to have the idea of what's the conceit of the setting. And don't violate that conceit. Play to the conceit, and Savage Worlds will allow you to do that. But your concept of your character is going to drive everything else forward, and then you're going to begin to see how you're going to shift that, more than likely based on what's going on. Alright, with that out of the way, let's talk about races. The core rulebook still refers to everything as races. As of Pathfinder for Savage Worlds, and moving forward with the Fantasy Companion, and from here on out, PEG has announced they're going to switch to Ancestries, following Paizo's lead on that, and just keeping in touch with how they're doing that. And it's a good bit of dovetail because they're producing more and more Pathfinder for Savage Worlds material. The big box set, Rise of the Rune Lords, the full thing, and Curse of the Crimson Throne should be here shortly. So that's where they're going with this. So let's talk about it. We're going to go in alphabetical order. I don't have all these memorized because I honestly don't see a lot of these in games. It depends on what you run and how you run things. So just basically play this if the first thing up is an android. Androids are robot people or some other kind of automaton. You play those because there's a variety of reasons to play these things, but if you're in a setting like a Warforged in Eberron would fall under android. Straight up androids in a super setting or in a cybernetic setting, like Cyberpunk, you can have androids as well. It really depends on the setting. Blade Runner, you have replicants would be androids. So the big thing about androids is they have a lot going for them. They're constructs, so they have bonuses to help out in combat. They have to be repaired. They can't heal naturally. But they don't breathe, they don't have to eat, they ignore wound modifiers to a degree, and that becomes very important because it can start a death spiral. And then outside of that, they have some hindrances attached to them, so that being a construct is awesome. But let's talk about the hindrances that come with them. These are all built into the android. Now there are ways of tweaking an android, and that's covered in how to create a character race, or just the GM's whims or the setting rules. So pacifist major. Androids are the three laws of Asimov by default are turned on, and so pacifist major means you're not going to do harm to a living creature. Nothing sentient can come to harm because of you, nor can you allow it to come to harm because of your inactions. Those kind of things. I can already hear it now. It is what it is. Outsider major. They are normally shunned by society, and you can dial this down a bit. The way you can capture this too is it's important to understand that just because you're in say a setting that has androids, they're still going to have a uncanny valley effect on humans, and no matter how well adjusted humanity is, that culture is, they're going to be weirded out by androids. So that's the outsider major. Basically, it's a penalty to dealing socially with sentient creatures. Other androids, you're fine, but sentient creatures, like, they're going to have that uncanny valley. It's going to that lizard brain is going to know something's wrong. And the last thing that they come with is vow, which is also considered a major hindrance. When we talk about hindrances, you'll understand between major and minor, but major is the big one. So they have a purpose, and that's part of your vow. You're either a combat android, you're a farmer android, you're a space explorer android, or just whatever it is, and you're going to have basically a prime directive. No lawsuits. And that's how you're going to fulfill that, and you're going to have to fulfill that through your vow. So Android, not a bad choice if you want to play something different. Like if you're playing something like Eberron, you're gonna go with Android to be a Warforged. Next up are the Aquarians. They're like merfolk. They breathe water. They can come out of the water. They can't drown. They have a solid movement rate when they're in water or underwater, so they're not going to splash around and swim or make athletics checks unless it's something very specific, kind of underwater stunts maybe. However, they also have dependency to that element, and so they're going to have to immerse themselves once every 24 hours in that liquid substance. And you could be a weird aquarium that comes from, I don't know, like a plasma planet where plasma doesn't kill them or whatever. It doesn't matter. You have to be immersed in that element for 24 hours. Or you start to take fatigue, and two levels of fatigue, and you're incapacitated, which means you're unconscious. And then you can actually perish if you continue that. And sometimes fatigue doesn't do that. In this instance, fatigue does do that. They do have low light vision, which means you ignore penalties of dim and dark, but not pitch black. So they can see a little bit in the dim and dark at night, or in rooms or underwater, but not in pitch black. So that is a benefit to playing in an aquarium. And they also are fairly a tough race, and so because of the atmospheric pressures, that adds to their toughness, which we're going to cover that when we talk about the attributes and the rest of the traits, and that helps you resist wounds and protect yourself basically from being wounded in combat. Next up are the avians. I don't know why they said avian, it's very French, but they're winged people. So the Arakoka, that's a D&D one, the Kenku, anything like that you can twist into the avian race and use that. The big thing for them is obviously flight. They fly twice as fast as most people can walk. However, they can't swim. They do take pretty big penalties when they get wet in the water. They're also very frail, so they lose a bit of their ability to sustain injuries. They also have very keen senses, right? You would expect that from an avian-oriented species, and so they begin with a higher notice skill than normal races do. They also have a reduced walking pace. So they're not going to just be as fast as others. They're going to be one point of pace behind. It's not a huge deal, but it can be if you're really invested in tabletop combat or the actual tactical side of the house. Dwarves, standard, classic fantasy race. It is what it is. They bring low light vision to the table. They have a reduced pace because of their size. But they also are tough, and so their natural vigor, which is an attribute of how healthy they are, begins at a step higher than most others. Next up are the elves. Again, standard fantasy elf. There are variations you can do with them, but the standard core they're very agile, so they start with a higher agility than normal. They're having all thumbs, which anything mechanical, because of their intense dislike of non-natural or non-magical, they have a penalty to when they use some of these things. And they also have low light vision, so like everyone else, they see in the dim and dark with no penalties actually. But pitch black still messes them up. Half elves. Half elves are in the game. They're what you expect. They have a heritage, so they get the grace of the elven parent and they get the adaptability of the human parent, and so they can either get the free edge of a human or they can get the enhanced agility of the elf. They also have low light vision. They're also considered outsiders, but not as bad as the androids. They're only minor because they're half elves in most fantasy settings. No one trusts half elves. They look at them with disdain. It just kind of is what it is. The half folk. This is Savage World's way of saying gnomes or halflings or anything else you can think of from any other setting you have. It's the half folk. So they are small. They have a reduced size, which reduces their toughness because they are tiny, but they're not like 2 feet tall. They're about 3 feet tall on average. They have a reduced pace because of their size, and they also are spirited, so they begin with a higher spirit than others. Spirit is kind of like wisdom and charisma mashed together for the D20 crowd. It's very handy in Savage Worlds, and there's no dump stat in Savage Worlds, so having a good spirit is legit. The last thing that small folk bring to the table is luck. They get 1 additional Benny. All players get 3 bennies to start, making sure I had 3 fingers up, and half folk gain an extra benny at the beginning of every session, which is fundamentally awesome. Alright, next up are humans. Humans are humans, it's what you'd expect. They're in every setting, everywhere. Normally they're every setting, everywhere. They're default. They have an adaptability. They get a free edge, and we talked about it before, but edges are sort of like feats, but much more powerful than feats in most instances. So as if you're a human, you get one of those for free. Every other race, except the half folks, the half elves, you have to purchase an edge, and we'll get into that when we talk about generating characters. But the humans get 1 for free. Next up are the Rakashans. They're a feline, anthropomorphic feline race for all of those wonderful people out there. Actually, the Rakashans are pretty cool. They're brutal. They're super agile, so they have a higher agility. They have a bite and claw attacks, and they're considered natural weapons, so they get to do their strength damage and a dire damage. Unlike Slade, like a normal human who doesn't have bites and claws, you're only doing your strength damage. They're bloodthirsty, so they're going to beat the piss out of all the foes that they have, and they're not really going to take prisoners. That's not really a Rakashan trait. They can't swim because cat. They have penalties to any athletics test made to swim. Again, we're going to cover a lot of this in greater detail. They do have low light vision, as you'd expect for a feline race, and Rakashans have to pick a racial enemy, and they have a penalty to socially interacting with those people. And they get that. It's a choice of theirs, and it has to be significant to the setting. It can't be like, oh, I hate dandelion people. No, you're going to pick like, elves or people or humans, whatever, but you get the choice. And then last up are the default races is the Saurians. And these are lizard people. You could play Dragonborn with these. You have to tweak it a little bit, but you can do that through edges. And so they're more lizard folk than Dragonborn, but like I said, Savage Worlds works with a lot of setting rules and with edges. So the big thing for Saurians, because they have an armored hide, they're going to get a bonus. They get a natural armor, so that automatically makes them more difficult to hit. Or not to hit, I'm sorry, more difficult to wound. They do have a bite attack to get a natural weapon, so they're going to do their strength damage plus the die damage associated with the bite, and you can't take that away from them, I guess, unless you shatter their teeth. They have an environmental weakness you have to watch out for, so they're cold-blooded, so if it gets too hot, they're going to start taking huge penalties to all their actions because of the heat, and it's a very significant penalty. And if you remember when we talked about Savage Worlds, you need a 4 or better on your die rolls. Well, they take a -4 to some of these environs that are super hot, like fighting in a volcano area, right? -4 to act, and it's just going to be, that's going to be bad. But they do take bonus damage from the cold attacks as well, so that's one round. They have keen senses, probably from their acute sense, right? And that gives them a special free edge, very specific edge, that gives them a bonus to notice, and that's just them sent in the air. And then last but not least, they are also outsiders. They do have that as a minor, because they're lizard people. So that is it for the core races in the book, and you pick the one that speaks to you, but you also have to remember not all these will be allowed. Like if you're playing Elder Scrolls with Savage Worlds, everything is at your fingertips, and you could literally use any of these races because they're all represented, right? And it makes a lot more sense. You may have to tweak them with settings, but that is it, and